From the very beginning, the Russian-Ukrainian war was compared to the Chechen war. The same objectives, the same methods, the same mistakes.
It was easy there to stop entire columns. Just 3 or 4 people with 5 grenade launchers could do it.
Almost 30 years have passed since then, but the Russians' approach to warfare has essentially remained the same. Destroyed cities, strikes on civilians, and total hatred simply because people want to live separately.
Our house survived, but the Federals had already been there. They tore up my grandmother's Quran, wrote obscene words on the walls, and wrote things about Chechens.
To understand why, after winning the First Chechen War, the country still couldn't break away from the Russian Federation, how the Kremlin ultimately managed to take control of an entire people, what mistakes were made in Chechnya, and how Ukraine can avoid them, all of this will be discussed today in a new episode of Us. Of course, we won't be retelling the entire course of the Russian-Chechen War. Even several hours wouldn't be enough for that. It is well known that the main reason for the First Chechen campaign was the people's desire to live separately from Russia. In 1991, the country found its own leader, who was elected as a result of a vote and declared the independence of Ichkeria. That was Dzhokhar Dudayev.
He truly had a certain charisma that allowed him to become who he became. Plus, well, we shouldn't forget that he was a general in the Soviet army, and not just any career general, if I'm not mistaken. His last position was commander of a strategic aviation division in Tartu, Estonia. So that's quite a serious position, one that not just anyone is appointed to.
At first, the Russian leadership at the time tried to negotiate with the former general, hoping to keep Ichkeria under Moscow's control. However, over the course of a few years, Dudayev's government grew stronger and a peaceful resolution became impossible. That's when the Kremlin tried to resolve the issue by force for the first time, sending a column of Russian troops into Chechnya troops they immediately disavowed after the operation failed. Just like in the best traditions of We're Not There.
Operation.
If it had been the Russian army fighting, at least a single airborne regiment could have resolved everything within 2 hours.
He stated that we are not servicemen of the Russian army. Here is the officer's personal number, which once again proves that we are servicemen of the Russian army. When discharged into the reserve, this number always remains with the identity card.
By the way, that miscalculation by the Kremlin's generals still hasn't taught the Russians anything.
Just like in Ukraine today, the Russian authorities made a mistake. They thought 10 tanks would roll in and everyone would scatter. It was so funny. They were shot up, their armored vehicles were destroyed, and that was the end of it. That was the first attempt. And then it became obvious that there would be a war, and it would be a brutal one. Of course, the Chechens were internally prepared for this war.
Just as the Ukrainians were well prepared. Which is why similar rhetoric from the Russian president 30 years later, on the eve of a new war, also yielded no results.
Once again, I address the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. Take power into your own hands. It seems it will be easier for us to come to an agreement with you than with this gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis who have entrenched themselves in Kyiv and taken the entire Ukrainian people hostage.
However, the refusal to capitulate both in Ukraine and in Chechnya did not stop Russia from pursuing the idea of invasion. So, the beginning of the war against the Chechen people, on December 11, 1994, Russians also went to restore order in a neighboring country. Well, almost like defending the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Just a week later, on December 28, Russia began launching missile strikes on Grozny. And on December 31, the army, using maps from the 1970s, was sent to storm the Chechen capital almost blindly.
That's not how you take a city. I don't know who even gave such an order or command. Sending troops into the city center without securing the rear wall, that's just not done. But we're military people, we've been given a mission, so those at the top must have thought something through. If every soldier starts questioning things, there won't be an army.
Doesn't that remind you of anything? The columns near Bucha also marched thoughtlessly to capture Kiev and, by the way, met the same inglorious fate. In both Ukraine and Chechnya, every from children to the elderly rose up to help their own soldiers.
An extraordinary unity of the Chechen people. Even those people who were somewhat dissatisfied with the domestic policies pursued by Dzhokhar Dudayev, all these disagreements were set aside. The Chechen people became a single whole, a united and unbreakable fortress, and they were, without any hesitation, absolutely ready to fight to the very end.
I say farewell to Russian mothers.
Let them take children off Chechen soil. We stand our ground.
Planning for the capture of Grozny was terrible. Despite the Russians' advantage, their columns lured into Grozny, where with less firepower the Chechens easily destroyed the tanks and APCs.
They approached Grozny optimistically, but met fierce resistance, facing rocket launchers that burned their vehicles. This equipment isn't fast and isn't designed for urban combat. In the narrow streets of Grozny, they were simply shot up, from any building, and with ease, entire columns were stopped by just 3 or 4 people with 5 rocket launchers.
Grozny fell only after several months, not in a matter of hours as the Russian command had expected. For 2 long years the war continued throughout Chechnya, but the Kremlin was never able to fully subdue the mountain people. Outmatching them in equipment, using aviation, and knowing the enemy had virtually no air defense, the Russians destroyed Chechnya village by village, reporting they had captured the new settlement, when in reality all that remained was scorched ruins. Unable to respond in kind, Chechen units like Shamil Basayev's group terrorized Russian civilians. In Budyonovsk, they seized the hospital, held 500 hostages, and demanded the withdrawal of Russian troops from Chechnya.
Shamil Basayev didn't consider he'd committed a crime. Why? Because, as I say again, just as there were hostages in the hospital in Budyonovsk, the entire Chechen people were hostages as well. He said, I demonstrated the situation of the Chechen people using Budyonovsk as an example.
In 1996, Russian special services tracked down Chechen leader Dzhokhar Dudayev and launched a missile strike. The new Ichkerian president sought peace with Russia. During Yeltsin's campaign, Russia agreed to a truce. The Khasavyurt Accords were signed, ending the war, granting Chechnya virtual autonomy.
August 31, 1996, Khasavyurt, Lebed and Maskadov signed accord.
Analysts cite what happened in the region after the ceasefire as the main reason for the start of the Second War and consequently Russia's victory and its current control over the Republic. Authorities couldn't separate from Russia. Calm situation. Despite the apparent peace, the area saw rampant crime and ongoing power struggles among the post-war elite.
These statements began to appear like Chechnya is a subject of Allah. They started to flirt with religion and religious circles in particular to support and ideologically reinforce their regime. They started involving religious leaders.
Terrorist groups also began to emerge in Chechnya on religious grounds, with their most notorious acts being the Beslan attack and the Nordos tragedy. Analysts believe these incidents made the international community turn away from Chechnya and led to the Russians' renewed invasion. Completing the picture with the involvement of the FSB, which blew up residential buildings in Bayansk, Moscow and Volgodonsk, Russia began the Second Chechen War in 1999.
What we saw there in Chechnya was what awaited Europe and what Ukraine is now experiencing.
Learned lessons from the first campaign. The Russians expected no sympathy again. They began with air raids. The Kremlin used this advantage until the end, destroying entire cities.
With such objectives, of course, the goal of the federal forces was the elimination of all supporters of independence, all armed supporters of independence, and complete control over the territory of the Republic, and by no means the arrest or elimination of people involved in terrorist acts.
Operating in small groups with the support of aviation and artillery, the Russian army left no chance for the armed units in Chechnya.
Combat operations were carried out as if in a desert. No civilians and losses were ignored. They did the same in Grozny.
What happened next is known to all. After defeat of units and occupation of country, former independence fighter Akhmat Kadyrov betrayed his comrades and accepted a truce on Moscow's terms. After he was eliminated, his son Ramzan Kadyrov took the president's seat and still rules Chechnya today, always bowing to the Kremlin, so he keeps his position. After winning in 1996 but failing to use their independence for 3 years, the Chechen authorities spent long dividing spoils, prize they hadn't counted on. Losing control, the region reached a point where the civilized world, which once supported Ichkeria's independence, turned away not to get involved with terrorism or fanatics. This shows how important it is not to stray from the path and to persist when the war seems won. Did you like this video? Then don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our Arsenal channel. The link is in the description below the video.